So we will get started here. And I'd like to welcome everybody to the Vashon Heritage Museum History Talks and send out a thank you to our sponsor, For Culture. Today's talk is on the history and restoration of the Virginia V and its service as part of the Mosquito Fleet. It's presented by Greg Beardsley, and we will have questions at the end. Please put your questions in our chat, and we'll take questions at the end. Now let's introduce our speaker. Islander Greg Beardsley started working with the steamer Virginia V Foundation in 1992, becoming a full-time volunteer and probably their biggest supporter in 1995. Greg is an expert on the restoration of the steamship and a driving force behind its restoration. When the vessel is on the water during our annual Vashon Island circumnavigation cruise, which we are not having this year due to COVID, Greg can usually be found below decks, sharing the engineering feats that power this historic vessel and Vashon icon. And I hope we will return next year with our cruise. Greg, thank you for being here to tell us about the Virginia V and how it was restored to celebrate its nearly 100 years of service.
Yes, thank you, Elsa. This vessel was actually principally restored by my partner at that time, Captain Malcolm Munsey. He and I both spent an inordinate amount of time going through the rebuild. He became president of the board and principal director of the restoration. My job was the machinery end of it and learn from him about the wood. So we can proceed on, Bruce. One of the first things that had to happen in the process was to become a National Historic Site, which I think the mayor of the city actually presented that to us. And then later, we became a National Historic Landmark in 1992. And that was presented by then Secretary of State Ralph Monroe, who also was a board member and very much involved in the fundraising of the vessel restoration. I think the vessel itself represents a class of passenger freight steamers that plied the waters of Puget Sound and were known as the Mosquito Fleet because they looked like mosquitoes leaving the downtown Seattle dock in the evening. We had several of the vessels in our bailiwick because Vashon has been and still continues to be dependent on ferries for access to the rest of the world. As shown in the pictures, I'm not sure exactly which dock it is, but how many passengers were offloading and reloading in their work clothes or Sunday finest. Bruce, next slide. And then later, we became known for carrying the campfire girls to and from Camp Sealth. And that was a big part of the vessel's life, as well as the individuals who did it. There's nothing easy about that task because you can see on the dock the amount of packages that had to be carried on and off the boat. but that was part of the game. The Virginia series started in 1908 with the Virginia 1. It was a gasoline-powered engine in it, and it worked for quite a number of years. The Virginia 2 replaced it, and it was, I believe, steam-powered. I can't recall exactly, but then came the Virginia 3, which was really the workhorse of the fleet and remained that in that position through the time of the restoration in 1935. Then the Tyrus was basically a placeholder for the engine, because that's where the engine came from. And we still honor the people who had the steam mill by flying their Eagle on the engine, which you'll see later in the slides. The Virginia 4 was converted to cargo carrying and went to Alaska, where it sank. There was a Virginia 6 being built, but it never did come to fruition. The principal route of the Virginia 5 was up the west side of Vashon Island. As you can see, it made many stops, and they were, some of them were what they call whistle stops, where you had to actually whistle down the boat. Otherwise, they'd just keep on going to the next stop. During the Sunday travel time, they actually made a direct route between Seattle and the municipal dock in Tacoma for a few times. And of course, if you look at the fare schedule, in the schedule of when they left and when they arrived, they were flying pretty fast. And they had to work at it pretty hard to make that, because the boat will not do that today. We limit its actual output to allow the vessel to survive. October 1934, the vessel was caught against the Olalla dock, and in what was confirmed, I believe, to be a hurricane wind, force winds, and it toppled the superstructure off onto the dock. There is very little known as to why the vessel was not just scrapped, because the damage was so great. But they took it to the Lake Washington shipyard and pulled the superstructure off of it and rebuilt it. As you can see, the machinery and the rest of the vessel were in pretty good shape. They only had to redo the wooden superstructure. Across the dock from it was the burned out hulk that became was the Peralta and became the Kalakala. And so they were neighbors at the dock during the restoration of the Virginia 5. I'm not sure which one was finished first, but they were completely refurbished. And then in 2002, after the restoration, we sailed past the Kalakala before it made its final journey to Tacoma, where it was dismantled. The triple expansion engine was actually, as far as I know, a 1904 creation, not the earlier rendition that's stated. It was put into the original engine was put into a tug that towed targets for Fort Worden. And they built a second engine just as a spare and in case something didn't work. And they sold that to the Christensens to put in the Virginia IV, or V, I should say. Now there's a couple pictures of the old engine, the old steam plant, and also of the old boiler, which had reached its final days before the restoration. It was quite a patch job to get it up and running for then, 1995. Then the restoration from 97 to 2002 was a much longer restoration than anybody thought it would be, primarily because of the amount of funds we had to raise and also the other things. In 1995, I believe, we went through a Coast Guard inspection after the Shipyard and Tacoma Marine Industries and failed. The Coast Guard was nice enough to give us a year's grace to operate the vessel, but if we didn't do the corrections that are on this slide, then we would not be allowed to carry passengers again. It was, although both Malcolm Muncie and I knew that this was the probability, it was still a shock to sit in the cabin of the Virginia V on a trip north, wondering what was going to happen. In the end, Malcolm Muncie took over the board and asked me to help him, which I was glad to do. And we set about the start of the restoration. In 1995, we got a grant from, or 97, I guess. We had a grant from the federal government through the State Department of Transportation and the King County Department of Transportation. And that was where partnership was actually formed to make this happen with with all the bureaucracy of King County and the state and the federal government. But the reasons for you can see in the picture of this on the screen now, is that the boat deck had holes in it. There were holes and rot in the passenger cabin. To a large extent, you can see how much we tore back. And the deck beams in the next slide, I think, were catastrophically disconnected from the hull. The tie rod shown in that picture right there was what was holding the vessel together. And the Coast Guard said, no more. So when we went into the shipyard at Lake Union Dry Dock, we virtually tore the house off, raised it up 6 inches or something like that, and started work on the hull and the frames. On the left or on the right side of that picture is the construction of the framing for the Virginia V. And it's made up of a series of sawn futtocks, they call them, sections. that overlap each other and are bolted together. And then the planks are attached to those. The transom is made up of a series of huge timbers that are sawn and warped to form the shape of the vessel. We had a spectacular find, if you will, in the blowdown timber of Mount St. Helens, and unfortunately it was full of bugs and it rotted out rather quickly. But you can see how we're dealing with some very large timber. In 1997, we began the haul out, replacing the hull, a big chunk of the hull, and the frames, and some parts of the transom. It really does show here how the timbers were in bad shape. They were rotted, and the frames had to be replaced. You can see the white painted ones are frames that are new. The ones that are not white are the old frames. That's the transom right there, and that's the last of the frames. The pictured on the right side is one of the hand-sawn timbers that make up the transom, and they are not only hand-sawn but then planed to meet the curvature of the hull. While all this was going on, the interior was being taken apart. We ended up replacing the shaft log, half of it, because it was so rotted, and that's the part that's down the center of the picture. Fortunately, Lake Union Dry Dock had a lathe that had a long depth of bore, and they were able to bore out the timber, and then we cut it in half to fill in. The picture shown here shows a lot of the timber that was replaced in the hull, but at the same time, you can see that there's less than half of the hull is being replaced. So over time, that will all have to happen. And it's a continuing process. When they get done with it's a relatively smooth floor picture of the hull. However, the hull is in other places is not as smooth, and we left it at full thickness of the planks so that the next time around the new plank would match up to the thickness of the hull and then make it smooth. I think we can go on to the next slide. This shows one of the shipwrights working on the hull right on the inside, or the ceiling actually, and where the deck beams are going to go. And then the deck beams that were put in there, you can see the blocking that was put underneath the house to replace, to move the house up and allow work on this part of the vessel. We put all new decking in, as in the next slide. well, maybe not that one. But now we're going too far, Bruce. And then the picture that Bruce showed of the condenser piece, that's how rotten the condenser was that we've replaced with the new one built by Seattle Boiler Works. And that's shown in the next slide, I believe. It's a little complicated in the engine room. There's not a lot of space, and there's a lot of stuff that has to be put in there. I think one of the slides shows the next part, I think, is trying to get everything put together to finalize where we were. Of course, we were continually fundraising. We ultimately ended up with probably $6 million in funds, and probably an equal amount in donated services and labor. So, but machinery had to be all rebuilt a second time, and the piping and everything else was completely removed, demolished, and we had to start all over again. And the next picture shows where the old boiler is, and we had left a big hole, and then brought the FOSS 300 in, which is a steam crane, and picked the old boiler up and put it on the deck, and they took it back, and I think we donated it to the Puget Sound Maritime Historical Society. I don't know what they did with it. It had a lot of asbestos in it still. Then we had the engine taken out, and it was sectioned and had Everett Engineering redo basically the whole engine. They bored out all the cylinders, they bored out the flat valves, and they inserted a huge liner in the low pressure cylinder. Fortunately, they had the technology and the wherewithal to basically freeze this entire sleeve so that they could push it into the engine, and it warmed up and it never moves again. This shows the engine being trued and bored. If you'll notice, in the middle right of the picture, there's a rectangular slot. Well, the engine is in two pieces. That slot forms the division between it, which allows it to be moved and put back in place. We had to bolt it together to true up all the piping and the rest of the cylinders in the shaft. So let's go on, Bruce. So you can see the finished product of the engine with the insulation and the lagging on it, as well as the eagle from the Lawrence Brothers sawmill, who owned the Tyrus, where this engine came from. Then on the right side is a picture looking forward of the engine in operation. Okay, let's go on. And so here's more pictures. The bearings are all, relatively speaking, lead Babbitt, which means they were poured in a mold and bonded to the steel uppers and bottoms. And then machined and placed in the vessel. And in many cases, when the shaft was brought in, it was what they call blued, and they placed it in the bearing holders and turned it, and then picked it back up and scraped the bearings wherever they touched until they got it down to the point where there's minimal deflection of the shaft. Here is a lubricator. It's the oiler for all of the lower moving parts on each of the 3 cylinders. Probably oils 20% of the engine. The rest of it is by hand, and it's a little bit exciting. It's probably not OSHA approved anymore. So as you can see here, there's oil caps that go on the bearings, and there's oil cups in the rods for the valve, the eccentrics, and the mains have a copper tube which comes down and oils it from a funnel that captures it from above in the lubricator. Next one. So this is showing the machinists at Lake Union Dry Dock pouring the lead babbitt into the bearing mold, and it was quite exciting. They all practiced this before the photo because sparks fly. Okay, so this shows the machinery aft in the back part of the ship. You can see the new water tanks that were put in on the side, one side. It's basically all been rebuilt back there with the brand new hot well, the silver tank, and a generator sound box. Oh, you can go on, Bruce. We have the main shaft bearings, which we modernized from a lead babbitt bearing to a craft bearing. And it shows the connection between the shafts sections, which have to be removed in order to do anything with the propeller. The circulator engine is the big round circle, and that's a simplex engine, meaning a single cylinder. You can go on, Bruce. This is the machinery on the starboard side. And you need to be about 4 or 5 foot tall to work down here comfortably. So it is a bit of a squeeze for the normal person today. There's a lube oil tank, and then you can see the engine in the far distance. Go ahead, Bruce. This is the machinery plan, how it's located within the ship, the water tanks, up through the hot well, up to the engine, and then the boiler, and then the fuel tank. And then forward of that is the new sewer tank and all the gear that's up there for that. Go ahead, Bruce. This is a steam piping diagram. It's looks fairly simple, but it's a whole lot more complex trying to fit it into the space of the engine room, as well as maintain drainage from forward to the aft part, so it all drain in the hot well. You can go on, Bruce. This is the auxiliary air pump, and the main air pump is to the right side of it, right there. Next slide. This is one of 4 duplex steam pumps that serve the various purposes on the ship. This one is the fire pump, as well as it can be used as a bilge pump if need be. Go ahead. This is a circulator from the other side, and we were fortunate to partner with Irish Foundry to make a new circulator. And that was put in during this restoration. Go ahead. This just shows some of the railings that were placed around where the boiler came out of. Continue on. Shows the old electrical panels too. This is the new electrical panel that was built specifically for this vessel. And it's capable of handling 2 generators, as well as shore power and most everything that were needed on the vessel. Go ahead, Bruce. This is a simplified schematic of the steam cycle, and you can follow this along. And there's a fire pump that heats the boiler, boils the water, steam goes into the engine, out of the engine into the condenser, which then is returned to the boiler to be fired again. Okay, Bruce. This was the new Babcock and Wilcox boiler, built 1990. Well, about 90, finished in 98, I believe. This is just before it was loaded onto the deck of the Foss 300 to go back and be placed in the ship. This shows the little tiny boiler that was being built in the West Point facility for Babcock and Wilcox. The boiler on either side of it is considerably longer than the picture shows, actually. And these guys had to relearn how to do the tiny work. Go ahead, Bruce. This is the front of the boiler with all the fuel and steam that is going in to atomize the fuel and also operate the boiler. It is a little bit complex, but nothing compared to what the modern boiler would have on it already set up. Go ahead, Bruce. This is the electrical panel, which we had to custom design with Babcock and Wilcox to fit the space. It's actually has a diagonal bottom to it, and we were able to put all the electronics in here. Go ahead, Bruce. This is the passenger cabin before it was rebuilt. Most of the plywood was laid down just so they could walk on it, and after they put the deck beams in. This picture finished with the new floor and the windows and everything else done to it. We have the after deck, which was pretty well taken apart, put back together again. Again, we used tongue and groove joints on it. So this is the finished product at least right now. So this is the main deck. It shows the port side framing, as well as where the house is around the boiler. And the next slide shows the finished product. That's actually the starboard side with the generator, steam generator, which we had used but no longer do. Entrance to the galley. This is a picture showing the preparations for viewing to put the new boiler in the vessel, and the Foss 300 is bringing it over. This is a picture of the hole that we had to clear through the framing to keep the, hoping that we weren't going to get rained on. Drop the boiler into this pit, so to speak. It's basically formed by the hull of the vessel and the lower engine room sides and whatnot. Go ahead, Bruce. Here's the boiler being lifted and placed in the vessel. It's a tight fit. This was the wheelhouse that the Seattle Community College woodworking group rebuilt. It was a compromise between the 4 other houses that had been on the vessel, and we made it so that all the required electronics could be up in the proper place for the captain to see. It's all nice wood. This is the foredeck with people on it. One of the staircases, one of the versions of stairways to the top deck. Go ahead, Bruce. This was 2005, getting ready to go into the synchro lift at Pacific Fisherman. The deck of this dock lowers and the keel rests on the center of that, and then they have a railroad, basically a railroad cart that allows them to push the boat back into, or tug the boat back into a covered area, and then continue to use the dock, which was good because we were there for quite a while. It took a lot more planking out again. This is only 3 years later, and most of it was stuff that we knew had to come out, but we waited until we had a little bit more breathing space. Go ahead, Bruce. It's a rather brutal process to take the plank out. The electric chainsaw cut through the outer skin, and then take and beat the wood with a chisel until it falls apart. Then you have to get the slide hammer, which is shown next. Not next. This is some of the frame some of the hull that was removed, showing the bones of the ship and the rot. And in some cases, most all of these planks were, when they were replaced, they treated the frames and then they put felt paper against it to keep anything at bay, because fungus just grows everywhere. Again, further back in the hull, you can see how they put blocks up to hold the hull in place. It's a pretty stupendous job. This just shows the sawn futtocks that were being bolted in place of the old ones that are compromised, and where we were putting in new hull planking. You can see our section there. This is the reason why many of the plank had to come off. The spike holding the planking in was completely rusted through, almost rusted through. So this is the slide hammer. This is being operated by the then senior captain and one of the mates. And basically they just hook on that bolt or nail and just hammer it out. Picture of the planking going back in. And if you'll notice, it's not straight. It's not a straight line. All of the planking had to be pictured and mirror made, and then in many cases steamed to make the curve to get onto the hull. So this is a picture in 1922 of the vessel, and then there's 2022, which will be her 100th birthday. This was actually a photo going through the Windermere Cup boat parade. I'm guessing in 2002, 2004 actually, but that's sort of that's the spiel for the vessel. Unfortunately, some of the slides didn't get in here, but one of the things that I caution everybody on is this vessel is on borrowed time. And just like the Wawona, which was taken to a dry dock and hammered into pieces, this vessel will not survive without continuous rebuilding. And there's enough planking left that's damaged or spore ridden that it needs to be replaced. About every couple of years, they take and haul the vessel out and do a Coast Guard inspection and replace planking. So that's my whole thing. Questions, I guess.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. What a beautiful boat, or am I supposed to call it a ship? It's gorgeous. We do have a couple questions, and let's see. Jessica Dwyer asks, who I just lost a second ago. Let me see. She was asking if it burned. Did she originally burn cordwood or coal or diesel, or what did she burn originally?
Originally, it was bunker fuel, heavy oil. Most of the West Coast steamships burned oil because of the availability of it near the port. The East Coast steamers tended to be more of the cordwood or coal variety. I will say that the boiler that was in the vessel was not designed to be burning oil, and so it wasn't very efficient. The new one is probably twice as efficient, at least, and burns diesel fuel.
Okay, and then Hazel Wilding wants to know again, what is a futtock? Futtock.
Futtock, that is a section of the frame, and because they build a frame out of two futtocks that overlap each other and are bolted together. So your frame is actually made out of two ribs, if you will. And because of the shape, they are bolted together, sawn out and bolted together in pieces. That makes sense?
Makes sense. How did, and so another question came in, how do they keep barnacles off of the hull?
Well, part of it is the paint. Part of it is the fact that that they're not heavily attracted to wood. And the short duration that the boat is in the water versus out of the water. Now it is in Lake Washington as its home port, Lake Union as its home port. And so the fresh water does not, kills off all the marine life pretty much.
Okay. And Lori Martin wants to know, when was the last sailing of the Mosquito Fleet boats to Vashon?
Well, a regular sailing of the Mosquito Fleet itself was to Vashon was probably in the late 30s when cars started to be part of the transportation package. The original Mosquito Fleet was designed to carry passengers only and freight, mostly because the roads were so poor in the wintertime, they could not get anywhere. As the roads improved, going through the swampy areas of our northwest, the ferries had, the Mosquito Fleet died, and the ferry system started taking cars and vehicles. So,
Greg, if I can jump in.
yep.
The last known sailing that I've been able to find was the Concordia in 1940. Made her last regular trip into Quartermaster Harbor. So 1940, and the Concordia was a smaller Mosquito Fleet boat that ran from Tacoma all through Quartermaster Harbor back to Tacoma. So to answer Laurie's question, 1940.
And Mr. Robert Federley wants to know, how is it determined which plank to replace?
Well, a lot of that is skill and use of a tap hammer by the ship ship surveyor. They listen for hollows and other things in there, or if the hammer sticks into the wood, obviously. In very rare cases, do they use a pointed awl or knife blade because they don't want to break anything down. But mostly it is just visual and then use of a tap hammer.
Okay. We've got a lot of questions in here, Greg. You're doing really well. Actually, Bruce wants to know a really good question. What is her top speed and how long can she travel at that top speed?
Well, I think they clocked about 12 knots going with the tide under the Narrows. Generally speaking, we figure 10 knots maximum speed. How far can she go? Well, anywhere within the limits of Puget Sound that we're allowed to travel can be traversed in one trip. The biggest problem is the crew. At the end of X 12 hours, the crew has to be replaced, so therefore you have to consider that, and the engineers usually have a couple, 3 hours on that clock before anybody shows up.
So Sharon Brixman in Arizona wants to know, where did B&W build the boiler?
It was built in West Point, Mississippi, in what they consider the Golden Triangle down there. I don't even know if the plant is still operating, but they had approximately 400,000 square feet under roof that they built these boilers in and then shipped them around the world.
Okay. And I should add that Sharon, she's a Vashonite. She's just stuck in Arizona because of COVID right now. Thanks, Sharon, for being here. Next question, are any plans being made for when the vessel is retired?
At present, I don't believe so. I think they're just continuing down the path of trying to maintain the vessel in an operating condition, which the discussions have started, however, because one of the problems is the requirement to have a licensed steam engineer operating, the chief engineer operating the vessel, and there are no other steamships to get time on anywhere. So it's becoming harder and harder to keep the vessel going. Yeah, at the present time, I suspect that, you know, that nobody wants to think about it, but there is some sort of plans to keep the machinery as an example if they can find a place to put it.
Mm-hmm. Greg, how many passengers can the Virginia V carry now, and how many passengers did it carry back in the days?
Well, 150 is, plus the crew, is all that's allowed today. And there's a sort of gray area with a doubling of the crew size in the certificate of inspection. The most passengers I believe that they carried was about 400 and something on a permit to and from the University of Washington for a football game.
So that's a lot of people, 400 on, wow, that's a lot of people.
It would have been packed. I mean, sardines.
And then let's see. Jessica Dwyer wants to know, what were her routes and her ports of call on Vashon Maury?
Well, the principal trip was up the west side, and it would start with Spring Beach, and I can't find the map offhand to refer to it.
Greg, I just put it up on the screen.
Okay, so it went up the West Pass, and it jogged back and forth between Spring Beach was being the first stop, Camp Sealth, across to Maplewood, back to Cross's Landing, up to Lizabula, to Olalla, to Cove, which is basically where the Cove Motel is, across to Figueria, which is opposite, and then it would go to View Park, which is up in the Cove area, and then back to Culvis, and then it supposedly stopped in Cedarhurst, but I don't know. That was probably a float because of the depth of the tide. And then Spring Beach and Biloxi was the last stop before it headed into downtown Seattle.
Okay, so here's one that might be an entirely different talk someday, but we'll see. I think it's either Lewis Webster or Jessica is asking this. They say, I recall seeing a photo of the Virginia V shipwrecked against a dock. Did I imagine that? No, you did not. You saw that. What's the story of Virginia 1 through 4?
Most of them were replaced as the increased load, and they were sold off, or in many cases, the old steamers were just run on a beach and burned, and the scrap metal collected. They were not built to last long. The fact that this vessel lasted as long as it has is pretty much a miracle. Some of the later owners, they ended up buying it out of, or taking it down to run on the Columbia River. And it was tied up under Marshall's Lock and Key during the war. And so therefore was unavailable to be scrapped, and then brought back to run in the Puget Sound by a number of different organizations. But the fact of the matter is that this boat, like its sister ships, should probably never have made it through the 30s. That's why the question has never been answered as to why they actually rebuilt the superstructure, because its time was over pretty much in the 30s.
Okay, here's another building technical question. What is the length and beam? Question mark.
It's 125 feet length, and it's about 28 feet in beam at the widest point.
And it's draft?
Draft is about 9 feet aft and about 6.5 feet forward.
Okay. And Shannon Flora wants to know, is there any big plans for the ship's 100th birthday?
Yes, there are, I'm sure, but I don't know what they are.
Okay.
That would be a question. That would be a question that have to be asked of the Virginia V Foundation.
Okay. Well, I think we got all of the questions. If anyone has any more questions, put them in the chat right now. Otherwise, we're right on the hour of 2 o'clock. So we can close down if there are no more questions. And thank you, Greg, so much for this great presentation. People can see the presentation probably by next week. It'll be on our website, and it will be there forever, and as long as we're around. So thank you very much. And that's it.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you, Greg.
You bet.